Good morning, all of you. I am your English teacher Rajkumar from Central Public School, Durjut, near Nandor. Today I am going to teach you lesson 8. A house is not a home of class 9th. This is a story written by Jan Gaudiso. In this, we will read about the challenges of being a teenager and the problems of growing up. How does the author overcome his problem? Come, let's read the story and get to know how does he overcome his problems and challenges. Okay, let's start. My first year of high school felt awkward after leaving junior high school at the head of my class with all the seniority the upper grade levels could afford me. It felt strange starting over as a freshman. The school was twice as big as my old school, and to make matters worse, my closest friends were sent to a different high school. I felt very isolated. In this story, the writer Zan Gaudiso is saying that he was in the first year in high school, and this feeling was very strange for him because he was sent to a different school where his friends were not there, and his new school was twice as big as his old school. And he was also very lonely in that particular school. I miss my old teachers so much that I would go back and visit them. They would encourage me to get involved in school activities so that I could meet new people. They told me that in time I would adjust and probably end up loving my new school more than I had my old one. They made me promise that when that happened, I would still come by and visit them from time to time. I understand the psychology in what they were saying, but I took some comforts in it nonetheless. So the writer is saying that he missed his teachers very much, and that's why he would go and visit his old school teachers. And the old school teachers used to encourage him, and they asked him to involve in school activities so that the people could know him well. They also advised him that there will be a time when he would learn to adjust probably and end up loving new school more than the old ones. The teachers all also made him promise that when it happened, he would still come by and visit the old teachers from time to time. The writer Zan Gaudiso understood the psychology in what his old teachers were saying, but he took some comforts in it nonetheless. One Sunday afternoon, not long after I had started high school, I was sitting at home at our dining room table doing homework. It was a cold and windy fall day, and we had a fire going in our fireplace. As usual, my red tabby cat was lying on top of all my papers, purring loudly and occasionally scratching at my pen for entertainment's sake. She was never far from me. I had rescued her when she was a kitten, and somehow she knew that I was the one responsible for giving her the good life. So one Sunday afternoon, what happened? We are going to just know. One Sunday afternoon, not long after the narrator had started high school, he was just sitting at home at his dining room table doing his homework, and it was a very cold and windy fall day, and they had a fire going in their fireplace. As usual, the narrator's red tabby cat was lying on top of all his papers. It was purring loudly and occasionally sweating at writer's pen for entertainment. The cat, the red tabby cat, was never far from the writer. He had rescued her when she was kitten, and somehow she knew that he had been the one responsible for giving her a good life. My mother kept stoking the fire to keep the house nice and warm. Suddenly, I smelled something strange, and then I noticed it smoke pouring in through the seams of the ceiling. The smoke began to fill the room so quickly that we could barely see. Groping our way to the front door, we all ran out into the front yard. By the time we made our way outside, the whole roof was engulfed in flames and it was spreading quickly. I ran to the neighbors to call the fire department while I watched my mother run back into the house. So the narrator's mother kept stoking the fire to keep the house nice and warm because it was a winter day. Suddenly, the narrator smelled something strange. He smelled something unusual, and then he noticed that some smoke was just pouring in through the seams of the ceiling. The smoke began to fill the room, and it started filling the room so quickly that the narrator couldn't barely see. He started groping in the room to the front door. They all ran out into the front yard. The narrator just ran out into the front yard, and by the time they made their way outside, the whole roof was engulfed in flames and it was spreading very quickly. Then the narrator ran to the neighbors to call the fire department, and while he was watching his mother run back into the house. During that time, when the house was on fire, he just went outside the room and he noticed that his mother just ran back into the house. My mother then ran out of the house carrying a small metal box full of important documents. She dropped the case on the lawn and, in a crazy state, ran back into the house. I knew what she was after. My father had died when I was young, and I was certain that she was not going to let his pictures and letters go up in the flames. They were the only things that she had to remember him by. Still, I screamed at her, "Mom, no!" So, in this, the narrator's mother ran out of the house and she was carrying a metal box in her hands which was holding important documents. Then she dropped the case on the lawn and, in a crazed state, she ran back into the house once again. And the narrator knew what she was after, means what she was looking for. The narrator is saying that his father had died when the narrator was young, and he was certain that his mother was not going to let his pictures and letters go up in flames. So they were the only things that she had to remember him by. And still the narrator screamed by saying, "Mom, no!" Means you are not supposed to go inside the house which is on fire. I was about to run after her when I felt a large hand hold me back. It was a fireman. I hadn't even noticed that the street had already filled with fire trucks. I was trying to free myself from his grasp, yelling, "You don't understand, my mother is in there." The narrator was about to run after her when the narrator saw that his mother was running into the house once again. The narrator also wanted to chase her. But when he felt a large hand hold him back, it was the hand of the fireman. Narrator hadn't even noticed that the street had already filled with fire trucks. So by the time the house was on fire and his mother was just taking the important documents out of the house, in the meanwhile the fire trucks had already reached the spot. He was trying to free himself from the grasp of the fireman, and the narrator was also crying loudly by saying, "You don't understand, my mother is in the house there." He held on to me while other firefighters ran into the house. He knew that I wasn't acting very logically and that if he were to let go, I would run, and he was right. So the fireman held the narrator while other firefighters ran into the house. The firefighter knew that the narrator wasn't acting very logically and that if he were to let go, the narrator would run and he will just run into the house which was on fire. And he was perfectly alright according to the narrator. "It's alright, they'll get her," he said. Then one of the firefighters said, "You don't worry about your mother, because the other firefighters had gone into the house and they will definitely and safely will take her out of the burning house." He wrapped a blanket around me and sat me down in our car. Soon after that, a fireman emerged from our house with my mom in tow. He quickly took her over to the truck and put an oxygen mask on her. I ran over and hugged her. All those times I ever argued with her and hated her vanished at the thought of losing her. So after that, the firefighter wrapped a blanket around the storyteller and he made him sit down in their car. Soon after that, a fireman emerged from his burning house with his mom in tow. He quickly took her over to the truck and put an oxygen mask on his mother. The narrator ran over and hugged his mother. All those times I ever argued with her. So all those times the narrator ever argued with her and hated her vanished at the thought of losing her. So at those times, the narrator argued with his mother and hated her at the thought of losing his beloved mother. She is going to be okay, said the fireman. She just inhaled a little smoke and then he ran back to fight the fire while my mother and I sat there dazed. I remember watching my house burn down and thinking that there was nothing I could do about it. Then one of the firemen said that she was going to be okay. He just said to the narrator. And he also added that she had just inhaled a little smoke when she went inside the house. And then he ran back to fight the fire while his mother and he sat there dashed. The narrator remembered watching his house burn down and thinking that there was nothing he could do about it. 5 hours later, the fire was actually finally out. Our house was almost completely burned down, but then it struck me. I hadn't seen my cat. Where was my cat? Much to my horror, I realized that she was nowhere to be found. Then all at once it hit me. The new school, the fire, my cat. I broke down in tears and cried and cried. I was suffering loss big time. So after 6 hours, the fire was totally out. The firefighters were able to put out the fire. And the narrator's house was almost completely burned down. Then suddenly it struck to the narrator that he hadn't seen his cat. He started thinking where his cat might be at this time. And much to his horror, he realized that she was nowhere to be found. Then all at once it hit him. It hit in his mind about his school, the fire, his cat. After thinking all these things, the narrator broke down in tears and he started crying loudly. And he was suffering loss, a big loss, big time. The fireman wouldn't let us go back into the house that night. It was still too dangerous. Dead or alive, I couldn't imagine living without knowing about my cat. Regardless, I had to go. We piled into the car with just the cloths on our backs and a few of the fireman's blankets, and made our way to my grandparents' house to spend the night. After this, the fireman wouldn't allow the narrator to go inside the house that night. According to the firefighters, it was still very dangerous to go inside the house. But one thing that is struck into the mind of the narrator was that he started imagining whether his beloved cat is dead or alive. He wants to see her. Regardless, I had to go. But they piled into the car with just the cloths on their backs and a few of the firemen's blanket. And then the narrator with his mother made their way to his grandparents' house to spend the night. The next day, Monday, I went to school when the fire broke out. I was still wearing the dress I had worn to church that morning, but I had no shoes. I had kicked them off when I was doing my homework. They became yet another casualty of the fire. So I had to borrow some tennis shoes from my aunt. Why couldn't I just stay home from school? My mother wouldn't hear of it. But I was totally embarrassed by everything. The clothes I was wearing looked weird. I had no books or homework, and my backpack was gone. I had my life in that backpack. The more I tried to fit in, the worse it got. Was I destined to be an outcast and a geek all my life? That's what it felt like. I didn't want to grow up, change, or have to handle life if it was going to be this way. I just wanted to curl up and die. So the very next day was Monday, and the narrator went to school. When the fire broke out, he was still wearing the dress he had worn to church that morning, but he had no shoes because he had already kicked his shoes off when he was doing his homework. They became yet another casualty of the fire. So he had to borrow some tennis shoes from his auntie. Why wouldn't he just stay home from school? His mother couldn't hear of it, but he was totally embarrassed by everything. The clothes he was wearing looked very weird. He had no books or homework, and all his backpack was gone. According to the narrator, he had his life in that backpack. The more the narrator tried to fit in, the worse it got. Then he started thinking that whether he was destined to be an outcast and a geek all his life. That's what it felt like. Now the narrator was so disappointed and he was broken down by the fire that he started thinking that he didn't want to grow up, change, or have to handle life if it was going to be this way. He just wanted to curl up and die. I walked around school like a zombie. Everything felt surreal and I wasn't sure what was going to happen. All the security I had known from my old school, my friends, my house, and my cat had all been ripped away. So the narrator walked around school like a zombie, a dull person. So he walked around his school like a dull person. Everything was strange to him and he wasn't sure what was going to happen in the next future. All the security he had known from his old school, his friends, his house, and his cat, all had been just taken away quickly from him. When I walked through what used to be my house after school that day, I was shocked to see how much damage there was. Whatever hadn't burned was destroyed by the water and chemicals they had used to put out the fire. The only material things not destroyed were the photo albums, documents, and some other personal items that my mother had managed to heroically rescue. But my cat was gone and my heart ached for her. There was no time to grieve. My mother rushed me out of the house. We would have to find a place to live and I would have to go buy some clothes for school. When the narrator walked through what used to be his house after school on that very day, means that is on Monday, he was shocked to see that there had been a great damage. Whatever hadn't burned was destroyed by the water and chemicals which have been used by the firefighters to put out the fire. The only material things not destroyed were the photo albums and documents and some other personal items that his mother had managed to heroically rescue. But his cat was gone and his heart ached for his cat. But there was no time for him to express his sorrow. His mother rushed him out of the house. They would have to find a place to live because they had no place to live after their house had already burnt down. And he would have to go buy some clothes for school. Up to this portion, thereafter we will complete in the next video. Thank you all of you. Have a great day.